The sun on Roman 4 did not rise. It detonated. That was how Dr. Marin Voss had come to think of it after 6 days on the planet's surface. Not a slow brightening at the horizon the way it happened back home, but a sudden, violent explosion of white gold at the edge of the flat world, as if the star itself resented being asked to illuminate this place. The desert did not warm gradually. It went from freezing dark to killing heat in less than 20 minutes, and the rocks cracked and pinged with the thermal shock, and the sand shifted in long sibilant waves that sounded, if you let yourself think about it, like breathing. Marin didn't let herself think about it anymore. She had the emergency kit from the shuttle. She had the med bag, battered now, one latch broken, the foam interior stained brown in the lower right corner from when Doyle had bled out against her hands on the second day. She had 4 liters of water, which was 2 days' worth if she was careful, and she had not been careful, because on this planet careful was a word that meant very little when the sand moved the way it did, and the only shade for 40 kilometers was a cluster of red rock formations. She was currently sheltering inside, pressed into a notch between 2 boulders, listening. Doyle had been the pilot. He hadn't made it past the first night, not from the crash, which had been survivable, but from the internal bleeding they'd both missed in the dark. She'd found it in the morning when the light came up, and what had been a man she'd worked beside for 8 months was a man who was no longer anything at all, and she'd spent an hour doing things that needed doing, and then she'd picked up the med bag and started thinking about what came next. What came next was 6 days of this. There was a sound. Not wind. She knew wind now. Wind on Roman 4 had a low, almost musical register, a hollow whistling through the rock formations that she'd started to find almost comforting in the nights when the temperature dropped and the stars came out in quantities that human eyes had not fully evolved to process. This was not that. This was a lower frequency, subsonic almost, a vibration she felt more in her sternum than heard with her ears. She'd first noticed it on day 4. She noticed it every time now, about an hour before the detonation of the sun, and then again in the long amber hours of late afternoon. Regular, purposeful. Something out there had a schedule. She pressed her back harder into the stone and checked the improvised splint on her right leg. The bone had been set badly. She'd done it herself in the first hours after the crash, biting down on a strip of torn sleeve while she manipulated the fractured tibia back into something resembling alignment in the dark with her fingers and her training, and the specific kind of focus you developed when there was no one else to do it. The splint was holding. But the infection had started on day 5, thin red streaks climbing from the shin toward the knee. And by now she measured and photographed the progression every morning with the same clinical detachment she applied to everything else on this planet. She was a doctor. She knew what the streaks meant if she let them go another 3 days. She also knew that she was alive, and that living bodies had a remarkable capacity for stubbornness that medical textbooks tended to undercount. She photographed the leg. She noted the measurement. She drank 40 milliliters of water, not 50, 40, and made herself wait while the heat built. The scouting party had been dead for at least 4 days when she'd found them. There had been 6 of them, a geological survey team from the Hegemony Research Station 200 kilometers northeast, judging by the equipment tags, or what was left of the equipment. She'd spent an hour with the bodies on day 2, before the infection took hold and before she'd understood the full nature of what lived in the sand. The deaths had not been from dehydration. The deaths had not been from the heat or the cold. The bodies had been partially consumed, and the consumption had started from below the legs, the lower torso, one survey team member missing everything from the pelvis down, the exposed ends of bone not jagged the way a surface predator's bite would leave them, but almost smooth, rounded, polished, as if whatever had taken the lower half had done it very slowly and very precisely. Not frenzied feeding, methodical feeding, something that was not in a hurry. She had photographed all of it, every body, every wound margin, every piece of equipment and every piece of what was missing. She'd spent the whole hour photographing and noting and keeping her hands steady and her breathing even, and when she was done, she'd walked back to the rocks and sat down and let herself have 10 minutes of not being steady, and then she'd picked up the med bag again. It was from one of those bodies that she'd pulled the shard. It was embedded in the soft tissue of the right forearm, angled inward, roughly 12 centimeters of something that looked at first like glass but wasn't. The refraction was wrong, the density was wrong, and when she ran her thumbnail along the edge it left a mark in her nail the way ceramic did, not the way mineral glass did. A biological structure. Dense, crystallized, biological. A tooth, or something functionally equivalent to a tooth, broken off mid-length, which meant the original structure was at least 20 centimeters long. She kept it in the outside pocket of the med bag, wrapped in gauze. She took it out now and held it in the shade between the boulders, turning it in her fingers, which was a thing she'd started doing in the evenings, the way other people might worry a coin or a prayer bead. Whatever grew teeth this size, this material, this shape, slightly recurved at the tip, serrated along one edge with a micro pattern she needed magnification to fully appreciate. It was not a surface predator. The serration was designed for lateral movement, not vertical bite force. Sawing, not crushing. Something that moved through a medium that offered resistance, and that needed to cut as it went. Sand, it moved through sand. She'd run the geological survey on day 3 because she'd had nothing else to do, and her training told her to use the tools she had. The portable soil analyzer from the emergency kit was designed for identifying mineral toxins in potential water sources, but it gave her enough baseline data to characterize the substrate. The result had surprised her. The sand of Karath 4 was not silicate in the standard sense. The crystalline content was unusually high. Nearly 60% of the measured sample came back as dense mineral crystal, interlocked at a fine grain level, which gave the whole substrate a kind of electrostatic potential that ordinary sand didn't have. Almost like the sand was charged, perpetually, just below the threshold of discharge. Almost like the tooth material. She thought about that relationship every day. The creature's teeth and the sand they moved through, made of the same fundamental stuff. She thought about whether that was coincidence or whether it was something more interesting than coincidence, the way predators and prey environments co-evolved over long enough timelines. The creature, if her hypothesis was right, wasn't just moving through the sand. It was part of the sand in some functional sense. That was why the wave patterns were so hard to distinguish at first. The creature's passage through the substrate was continuous with the substrate itself, like a current in water rather than a solid object in solid medium. She was on day 3 of that hypothesis, and she had not yet found a way to test it. She put the tooth back in the pocket and looked at the desert. The surface was perfectly still in the rising heat. Nothing moved, not even the small 6-legged scavenger birds she'd seen on the first day, hopping between the rocks on legs that bent in directions she found aesthetically unsettling. She had not seen those birds in 4 days, and she had long since stopped wondering why. She heard the other shuttle before she saw it. The sound came from the north, a different engine signature than the Hegemony research station would use, higher pitched, with a resonant harmonic that she associated with sovereignty-class vessels, the kind that moved diplomats and dignitaries and people whose time was considered valuable. She came out from between the boulders carefully, taking her weight on the good leg first, and shielded her eyes against the detonation sun with one hand. The shuttle came in low and fast, and it was in trouble. She could see the port stabilizer oscillating, a long, thin contrail of venting atmosphere from somewhere behind the engine housing, and she thought, before she could stop herself, that the pilot was doing everything right, fighting it, holding the nose up, not panicking, making the controlled decision to put it down rather than fighting for altitude he wasn't going to get. And then the shuttle skipped once against a dune, and the stabilizer went completely, and it went sideways and plowed a long red furrow in the sand and stopped. Marin watched the dust settle. For a moment nothing moved. The desert was absolutely still in the way it got when the subsonic frequency was in it, everything holding its breath. Then the emergency hatch blew and figures began to climb out. She counted 5 and then a 6th. 5 moved immediately into a perimeter pattern spread, angles covered, the specific coordination of people who had trained together extensively and didn't need to discuss it. Soldiers or guards. The 6th figure emerged last and moved differently. Unhurried, upright, the particular deliberateness of someone who had been trained since birth that the appropriate pace for a second heir of the 3rd house of the hegemony was whatever pace she chose, because things waited for her. Marin recognized the house markings on the shuttle's tail section even from 100 meters. The inverted crescent and 3 descending dots of Verath Salin, the 3rd house. She'd seen that sigil on a minor functionary's collar 6 months ago at the research station. A man with a parasitic eye infection who'd been embarrassed about it. And she'd been careful then to treat him with the same thoroughness she'd have given anyone, because a doctor who treated patients according to their political significance was not a doctor who deserved to keep practicing. She looked at the 6th figure again. The way the escort arranged themselves, not just around the figure but angled toward her, weight shifted slightly inward, the body language of people who would put themselves between this individual and harm without needing to be asked, and without framing it as a sacrifice. An heir, possibly the heir. Marin pushed off the rock and started across the sand toward them. Moving on the bad leg across open sand was a calculated risk, and she'd run the calculation in the seconds she'd had. The creatures followed vibration. Her gait produced vibration, especially now with the irregular weight shifting the splint forced on her. But the creatures were on a schedule, and the schedule's afternoon window was still 2 hours away by her reckoning, and the people who just crashed were about to do something loud and vibration-heavy if no one stopped them, and 100 meters of risk was better than certain death by proxy. She called out in hegemony standard when she was 50 meters out. Her accent was rough. The consonant clusters in standard were not kind to human vocal anatomy, and she'd never fully beaten the rounding that English put on them, but it was functional. She'd made sure of that. Your shuttle is down. I assume you know that. I'm Dr. Marin Voss, human medical research staff out of the Northeast Station. My own shuttle came down 6 days ago. I've been sheltering in the rock formation to the south. I need you to listen to me about the ground here before you do anything else. The escort had her in their sights inside 2 seconds. Fast. 4 weapons, 4 different firing positions, good angles. The 5th guard was covering the opposite direction, which meant whoever trained them had emphasized the threat of misdirection. Whoever trained them was good. The 6th figure raised one hand, and every weapon came down. That was the second most useful thing Marin had seen in 6 days, second only to the geological survey data. The figure looked at her across the distance. "You are injured," she said. Not a question. The voice was lower than Marin had expected, and the hegemony standard was precise in a way that suggested the speaker had been corrected for accent at some point, schooled out of regional inflection, which was something that happened to people who were expected to represent something larger than themselves in every conversation they had. "Yes," Marin said. "Fractured tibia day 1, soft tissue infection day 5 currently managed. I'll live if I get off this planet in the next 48 hours. She paused. "What I'm telling you is that we need to be off this planet before that. Not in 6 hours. Not in 2 hours if we can help it." The senior escort, she could read rank from the insignia now that she was closer. 5 years of working alongside hegemony personnel had been good for something. Looked at her with the expression of a professional who has been told something by an unknown quantity and is deciding how seriously to weigh it. "Our distress signal is transmitting," he said. Recovery will arrive within 6 hours. That's too long, Marin said. The heat. This isn't about the heat. She unzipped the outside pocket of the med bag and held up the tooth. She held it the way you held a piece of evidence you needed people to understand, not too far and not too close, in the light. This is what I pulled out of the forearm of one of your survey team members. 4 days dead when I found them. All 6 of them. Nobody moved for a moment. The 6th figure stepped forward through the perimeter without looking at the guards, which was how Marin knew the perimeter was for other people's benefit. She extended her hand, and Marin gave her the tooth. She held it, turned it. Her hands were gloved desert gear, high grade, the kind the hegemony issued to its most protected people, and the tooth caught the alien sun and threw cold light through the crystalline structure. Something changed in her face when she held it. Something careful and still came into it. The same thing Marin had seen in the faces of colleagues receiving test results that confirmed the thing they'd been hoping wasn't true. The controlled reception of unwanted certainty. "Where precisely did you find this?" she said. "Embedded in the soft tissue of the right forearm of one of your survey team. Impact angle suggested it broke off during feeding. The survey site is about 4 kilometers east. There's nothing left of it worth going back to. Our survey team, flat, absorbing. They stopped transmitting 11 days ago. We were told it was a communication failure in the northern relay." "It wasn't a relay failure." A pause that had weight in it. "My name is Sci-Fi Stories," the figure said. "Second heir of the 3rd house of the hegemony. These are my personal escort. You will advise us on the shelter, and you will tell me everything you know about what made this." She held up the tooth. "Yes," Marin said. "That's exactly what I was going to do." Getting the heir and 5 armed escort members into the rock formation took 20 minutes and was not peaceful. 2 of the escorts wanted to go back to the shuttle for additional weapons and a supply case. Marin said no, flatly, without apology, and explained about the subsonic frequency, and the schedule, and the fact that additional weight on the shuttle's entry point would produce ground vibration in exactly the range and pattern she had been documenting for 4 days. When neither escort seemed persuaded they were soldiers, they were trained to mistrust unknowns. She did not hold it against them, Kethai said quietly. "We go now," and they went. Inside the rocks, in the heat-layered shade that smelled of mineral baked into stone, Marin laid out what she knew. She did it the way she'd laid things out in difficult conversations, with patients who deserved the truth about difficult diagnoses, systematically, no cushioning, no softening of the parts that were bad. The tooth, the feeding pattern on the survey team, the schedule which she'd built over 4 days of observation. The creatures were most active in 2 windows, pre-dawn and late afternoon, with a midday quiescence that she attributed to thermal behavior. Either the heat drove them deeper or their biology had a rest cycle tied to surface temperature. The fact that surface vibration appeared to be their primary detection method, the wave patterns she'd observed in the sand, and what they implied about both numbers and individual size. The absence of scavenger birds for 4 days running. "Multiple individuals," she said. "Based on the wave pattern separation and the cross-tracking I observed on day 4, I believe there are at least 3 distinct animals in the immediate area, possibly more ranging further out. They use the sand substrate as a combined movement medium and sensory field. Vibration from the surface propagates through the crystalline matrix, and they read it the way a spider reads its web." She paused to let that settle. "Which means standing still is safer than walking. Sitting is safer than standing. And vehicles, anything with a running engine producing continuous ground vibration, is essentially a dinner invitation." The senior escort, his name was Davin, she'd learned, was quiet for a moment with the expression of a man running calculations. "Our distress signal includes a surface beacon, ground-penetrating pulse, Standard search and rescue frequency. What frequency? 19 kilohertz, pulsing every 4 seconds. Marin looked at him. She looked at Kethais. Kethais was already looking at Davin. Turn it off, Marin said. Upper bandwidth only for the distress signal. The recovery team will find you. It'll take longer, but they'll find you. Without the surface beacon, the estimated recovery window extends too. Turn it off, Davin, Kethais said. He did. Marin let out a slow breath and sat down on the flat rock she'd been using as a bench for 6 days, stretching the bad leg out in front of her. One of the younger guards, a woman, the only woman in the escort, rank of what translated roughly to specialist, was watching her with an attention that felt professional rather than rude. I'm Teva, the young woman said. Field medic certification. Marin, medical research. Do you have antibiotics in your kit? Broad spectrum, yes. What concentration? Standard field issue. Marin thought about this. We'll leave the leg as it is for now. If we're getting out of here in the next 2 hours, it's not worth the disruption of redressing it. If we're here longer than that, we'll reassess. You've been managing this for how long? Onset day 5. Today is day 6. She met the medic's eyes. I know what the streaks mean. I'm choosing to know what they mean and continue functioning anyway because the alternative is to stop functioning, and that's not something I'm currently able to schedule. Teva looked at her for a moment with an expression that seemed to be deciding whether this was admirable or alarming. She appeared to arrive at some private verdict that Marin didn't ask about. The afternoon built its heat around them. Kethais sat on the ground, not on a rock, on the ground, the unpretentious move of someone who was past managing appearances, and asked questions. She had a great many questions, and they were good questions, asked in sequence without redundancy, each one building on the information that the previous had established. Marin answered all of them. At one point Kethais asked, "What is your assessment of our chances if we remain in this position until recovery arrives?" Marin thought about it honestly. The rocks appear to provide some buffering. The substrate under a formation like this is denser, more compacted, less hospitable to the creature's movement pattern. I've been here 6 days and they haven't come into the rocks, but that's a sample size of 1. She paused. If we remain still, keep vibration minimal, and the creatures don't change their pattern or number, I estimate reasonable odds. If the recovery craft comes in on standard approach with engines running hot, it will produce a ground vibration signature that will bring everything in the area to our location very quickly. So we need to brief the recovery team on landing protocol. Yes. Can we reach them on upper bandwidth with sufficient detail? We'll need to try. Kethais nodded once, the nod of someone who has understood the shape of the problem and is now moving to the next thing. The survey team, she said after a moment. You said you found them on day 2. Before you understood fully what you were dealing with. Yes. You stayed to document them. I'm a researcher, yes. It would have been faster to leave. Faster to leave, but then I'd have had less information about what I was dealing with. Marin paused. Fear is just observation that hasn't been organized yet. You can be afraid and still observe. In fact, fear makes you a better observer if you let it. Everything slows down, the details sharpen. The trick is not to let the observation stop. Kethais was quiet for a moment. Then she said, My house's research administrators classified this site as minimally surveyed but viable for personnel deployment. That classification is what authorized the survey team's mission. I know. That classification was wrong. Yes, Marin said, it was. Someone signed off on it without adequate data. That's my assessment. Another silence. Outside the rocks, the desert was building toward the late afternoon window. Marin could feel the frequency change in the air, not the full subsonic yet, but its precursor. A faint increased tension in the atmosphere that she'd learned to read the way you learn to read the light change before a storm. My mother had a phrase, Marin said, not sure why she said it, only knowing it felt appropriate. She used to say the stubbornest thing in the universe is a human being who's decided they're not done yet. She paused. I decided I wasn't done on day one. I've been redeciding it every morning since. Kethais looked at her. The hegemony's xenobiological profile on humans describes a relatively fragile baseline species, she said. Limited physical robustness, low thermal tolerance range, extended recovery from physical injury compared to most cataloged species. That's accurate. It doesn't seem adequate. No, Marin agreed. It doesn't capture everything. It was in the third hour of waiting that the sand moved. Teva saw it first. She was sitting near the outer edge of the formation, close enough to monitor the approach corridor they'd all agreed to watch, and she didn't say anything. She put 2 fingers on Davin's forearm, and everybody in the rocks was looking at the same stretch of desert before Marin had fully registered the alert. A long, slow ripple, 50 meters out, moving south to north, sinuous, unhurried. Then a second, running parallel to the first at 10 meters remove. Then a third from the northeast, crossing the other 2 at a shallow angle. Marin counted them. She timed the intervals. She noted the relative amplitude of the wave patterns. The third was producing a larger displacement, deeper keel, heavier animal, or possibly faster movement from the same animal. 3, she said quietly. Search pattern. They registered the impact when your shuttle came down. They've been working the area since. How long will they search before moving on? Davin said. I don't know. I've never observed them lose interest in a site. They may be persistent trackers. She watched the ripples converge and diverge. Don't pace. Sit down. Anyone who needs to shift weight, do it slowly. Everyone sat. It was in that sitting, in that enforced stillness under the heat and the watching, that Marin had her clearest thought about the shuttle. She'd been turning it over for hours, the way she turned the tooth over in her fingers, not yet a plan, more a set of conditions being tested against each other. The shuttle, the Type 7 plasma core, the geological analysis of the sand, the electrostatic potential in the crystalline matrix, the creature's apparent nervous system sensitivity to vibration, which she'd been thinking of as a limitation, but was actually both a limitation and a property that could, theoretically, be turned against them. The purge discharge from a Type 7 core, set to lateral field aperture, would propagate through the crystalline substrate at a velocity she could estimate from the survey data. The energy wouldn't dissipate in sand the way it would in ordinary silicate. The crystal matrix would conduct and amplify it, the way a wire conducted current. The creatures were in the sand. The sand would carry the pulse to the creatures. She needed someone to get to the shuttle without triggering them. She looked at Teva. Tell me about your movement training, she said. Specifically low-vibration field work, infiltration, surveillance, anything where you had to move slowly across a surface without detection. Teva looked at her with an expression that sharpened. She was smart, this one. 3 years in low-gravity insertion work before this posting. You learn to move like you're not there. Can you move like you're not there on sand? Slower, yes. I need someone to reach the shuttle and access the manual purge panel on the port side under the equipment bay. The purge vents the core charge in a directed discharge. I need the field aperture adjusted to near horizontal. The default is 45 degrees. There's a manual override in the purge settings. And I need the delay trigger set to maximum. On a Type 7, that's 4 minutes. Teva looked at her steadily, and then you come back, fast, at normal speed. You want them to follow me. The pulse will follow both of you. The creatures will converge on your vibration signature as you run, and the pulse will hit them in the sand while they're moving toward you, everything connected by the substrate. She paused. It's not without risk. If the timing is wrong, if the pulse doesn't propagate as fast as I estimate, you'd be between the creatures and the discharge front. What's your confidence in the estimate? 70%, Marin said honestly, based on sand composition data from a portable analyzer designed for water quality testing, which is not ideal. Teva thought for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked at the air. Kethai's looked back at her. Go, the air said, come back. 2 words, the first in order, the second something smaller and more real. Teva handed her weapon to Davin, because the weapon would be extra mass and extra noise, and would not help her if the creatures found her, and moved to the edge of the rock formation and looked at the open sand. Marin said, slow, every step full contact with the ground before you shift weight. The vibration of a heel strike is different from a full foot contact. When you need to stop, crouch, don't stand. Every 30 meters, pause and read the surface. And when I come back, full sprint, don't look at the sand, look at me. Teva nodded once, then she stepped out into the open. Watching her cross was the longest 11 minutes Marin had spent on a planet that had given her a great many long minutes. The young guard moved with a concentration that was almost beautiful to observe, each foot placed with the deliberateness of someone threading a needle, the slight crouch at each pause, the patience of it. The sun was high and cast no shadow. The ripple patterns from the 3 creatures continued their slow search arcs to the northwest, 200 meters out, none of them converging. Nobody in the rock formation made a sound. Marin was aware of Kethais beside her, standing now, still in that absolute way. Whatever was happening inside the air during those 11 minutes was behind something very well constructed. But the still was effortful in a way that Marin could see if she knew what to look for, a slight tension in the jaw, the hands deliberately open at the sides rather than closed. Marin thought about her own mother's stillness, which was a different kind, the stillness of a woman who had decided that things didn't get to start until she was ready for them to start, which was not control exactly but something adjacent. Stubbornness wearing a calm face. She thought about how she'd watched that stillness as a child and thought it was coldness, and how much later in life she'd understood it was the opposite. Teva reached the shuttle, disappeared through the hatch. Davin said very quietly, 4 minutes. Plus travel time back, Marin said. 7 minutes from now, roughly. If she reaches the panel without difficulty. Yes. The 4 minutes were very quiet and very long. The creature ripples drifted further northwest. The sun pressed down. Marin kept her eyes moving between the shuttle hatch, the sand surface around the shuttle, and the 3 wave patterns in the distance, reading the intervals, checking the schedule. Then Teva came back out of the hatch. She came out fast and moving, and even across the distance Marin could see the slight urgency in the way she oriented herself toward the rocks, and in that same instant the closest of the 3 wave patterns changed direction. It changed direction with the speed of something that had been undecided, and was no longer undecided. It's got her, Davin said. His voice was level with an effort. Marin was already coming out from between the boulders, putting weight on the bad leg because there was no time to be careful about it. The pain registered, and she filed it and moved past it. Teva, run. Come straight to us, don't angle straight line. Teva ran. She was fast. Faster than Marin had expected, the kind of fast that lives in the body below conscious decision, and she came across the red sand in long explosive strides, and the wave pattern behind her accelerated into something that was no longer a search. It was a pursuit, a direct convergence, the surface of the sand rising slightly just behind Teva's feet as the creature oriented on the highest vibration source available. And then the second wave pattern turned. And the third. All 3 converging from separate arcs. Teva was 30 meters out, and the nearest creature was 20 meters behind her, and the other 2 were closing from the flanks, and Marin felt the full subsonic frequency now in her chest, three sources overlaid, resonating against each other in harmonics that made her vision blur at the edges. She thought, please, in no particular direction, please. The sand erupted. The pulse from the Type 7 core went out in a flat disk exactly as she needed it to. She saw it as a pressure wave, a visible compression ring propagating outward through the sand at the velocity she'd estimated, slightly faster actually. The actual crystal matrix conductivity running higher than her portable analyzer's conservative estimate, which was the most satisfying kind of error to have made. The ring reached the first creature in under 2 seconds, reached the second a half second later, reached the third from behind while it was still in forward pursuit, and therefore fully extended in the substrate, maximum contact surface, maximum exposure to the discharge. The sound the three creatures made was not something she had language for. It was below language, below hearing, felt entirely in the body, a terminal frequency, the sound of something very large and very certain suddenly encountering something it had not been able to anticipate. Then Teva was inside the rock formation and Davin had her, and everyone was braced and moving, and the echoes of the pulse were still reverberating through the stone under Marin's feet, and she stood at the edge of the boulder formation on her bad leg with her hand against the stone and looked at the desert. The surface was still. 3 columns of smoke rose, blue-white and crystalline shimmer, from 3 points in a wide arc around the rock formation. Marin could see, in 2 of the 3 locations, shapes just below the surface, dark, massive, absolutely still. The sand had collapsed back over them, the way water closed over a thrown stone. The third shape was the largest, and it had been close enough when the pulse hit that the dorsal ridge. If it was a dorsal ridge, she was working from first principles here, had broken the surface. She could see it clearly in the afternoon light, a ridge of white gold crystalline scaling 3 meters long, the same material as the tooth in her pocket, the same material as the sand, the same beautiful, terrible material that was this whole planet. She stood and looked at it for a long time. She thought about the survey team. She knew all 6 names by now. She'd read them off the equipment tags that first day, the day she'd spent an hour with her hands moving carefully and her face controlled and her notes accumulating. Petra Veen, lead geologist. Siren Ol, mineral analysis. Corin and Tal Merck brothers, survey technicians. Asav Velt, communications. Jin Rask, the youngest, whose ID tag still had a training certification date from 8 months ago. She thought about whoever in the Hegemony Research Administration had signed off on deploying 6 people to this site with inadequate predator survey data. Probably someone who'd looked at the geological projections and seen a number that needed to be bigger, and had signed a form without asking the question that would have made the form take longer. The logic of a person trying to fix a broken thing, an economy, an expedition budget, a quarterly target, without understanding what they were fixing it into. She thought about Doc Jenkins and his brother in the research station files she'd read, the story the administrator there had told her once over bad synthetic coffee, a small-scale ecological intervention, hormones dumped into a water system to increase fish populations, not knowing what already lived in the water. Good intentions making catastrophic outcomes. She thought about how often that was the shape of things. She went back to the rocks. Kethais was standing at the outer edge of the boulder formation. She'd come out while Marin was standing in the desert, and she was standing very straight with her hands at her sides, looking at the smoke columns. "It worked," she said. "Yes. You calculated all of that from a portable water analyzer and a tooth." "And 4 years of xenobiology electives," Marin said. "I was extremely annoying in those classes. My professors did not enjoy the frequency of my hypothetical questions." Something moved in the heir's face. The corner of the mouth, a faint deepening at the eye, the small real version of a smile, the one that wasn't constructed for anyone. "My house has a research station on Kareth Roman 4, Kethais said. I came to formally close it, The site was classified as unviable after the survey team stopped responding. A pause. The classification cited communication failure. Yes. I was not told what actually happened to them. No, you weren't. Marin paused. I need you to know their names. She said all 6 names. Slowly, clearly, in the correct hegemony pronunciation, because she'd been practicing the consonants for 6 days without quite knowing why. She said them and watched the air receive them and didn't look away. Petravine, Siren Ol, Koran Merk, Tal Merk, Asavelt, Jin Rask. Kethais was very still. I want all of your data, she said finally. Every photograph, every measurement, every observation. You can have all of it, in exchange for a direct medical flight to a facility with intravenous antibiotics. That was never in question, Kethais said immediately. That was never going to be in question. I wasn't sure, Marin said. I've learned on this planet not to assume what's in question until it is. The recovery team arrived 43 minutes later. Not 6 hours, 43 minutes, because the upper bandwidth signal had been caught by a relay station with longer reach than the surface beacon would have reached, and the relay had flagged it for priority response based on the house identification in the signal header. And whatever you could say about the Hegemony's Expedition Administration, its emergency response to missing nobility was extremely efficient. Marin sat on the floor of the rescue craft with her back against the bulkhead, and her bad legs stretched out in front of her, and let the field medic work. The antibiotics went in through the forearm line, and she felt the cool of them moving toward her shoulder and thought, with a clinical detachment that was starting to soften at the edges now that the emergency had passed, about inflammation cascades and tissue recovery timelines, and what the next 72 hours would look like. Good odds, if the medication was what it claimed to be. Good odds on the leg. She was going to keep the leg. The thought arrived with a quiet satisfaction that she let herself feel for exactly 1 second before filing it. Kethais sat across the cabin. There was a great deal of activity, escort personnel being attended to, the shuttle crash site being logged, someone delivering a situation report in the clipped register of military briefings. Marin kept her eyes on the medic's hands and listened to the numbers and stayed out of the way. She was very good at staying out of the way in other people's emergencies now that her own was technically over. At some point, the air crossed the cabin and sat down on the floor beside her. Not on a seat, on the floor close, the way people sat when they had stopped managing the impression of themselves. The planet will be quarantined, Kethais said. Full ecological survey, properly resourced. The species will be documented before anyone sets foot there again. Good. The administrator responsible for the survey team deployment will be formally investigated. Good, Marin said again. Outside the viewport, Karethroman 4 was already becoming small, the enormous flat expanse of red and gold, the rock formation she'd lived inside for 6 days, the long scar of the shuttle furrow. She could see the wave patterns from up here, the record of the creature's search arcs written in the disturbed surface, 3 of them terminating in the smoke columns that were still rising. She would write it all up. She would write it with precision and no cushioning and the full list of 6 names in the acknowledgments, and she would recommend a formal investigation into the administrative decision chain that had led to this, and she would not soften that section. She thought about her mother's phrase, the stubbornest thing in the universe. She thought about 6 mornings of deciding, all over again, that she was not done. Beside her, Kethais had been still for a long time. Then, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone doing something without a protocol for it, the air reached across and placed her hand over Marin's where it rested on the deck. Not a formal gesture, not a diplomatic gesture, just a hand over a hand, the oldest gesture, the one that needed no translation across species or politics or the long, careful distance between people who had been strangers 6 hours ago and were something else now. Marin looked down at it, Then she looked at the stars. She did not move her hand. The medic across the cabin found something very interesting in his supply kit at that particular moment and kept his eyes on it, which was a professionalism Marin noted and appreciated quietly. "You should sleep," Kethai said. "I should," Marin agreed. "I haven't much in 6 days." "I know." I kept telling myself I should stay awake, in case something needed to be observed. "Something has been observed," Kethai said. "Thoroughly, you can stop now." "Can I?" "I will be awake," the air said. "For as long as this journey takes, you can stop now." Marin thought about that. She thought about what it meant to hand the watch to someone else, to trust another set of eyes in the dark. It was not something she'd had the opportunity to practice recently. She thought, I was not done. I was correct that I was not done. She let her eyes close. The last thing she was aware of in order before sleep took her, the weight of the air's hand over hers, steady and warm. The distant regular sound of the craft's engines, nothing like the subsonic frequency, nothing like a schedule, nothing like something that meant harm. The clean dark of space through the viewport, full of indifferent stars. The desert receding below her, still and quiet, its secrets documented. She slept. She did not dream of sand. There were things about the 6 days that Marin had not told Kethais during the questioning, not because she was hiding them, but because they were not useful information for survival planning. They were the other kind of information, the kind that accumulated in the silences between observations. On day 3 she had cried once for approximately 15 minutes, and then stopped and washed her face with exactly 30 milliliters of water. More than she should have used. She'd noted it in the log and gone back to the geological survey. The crying had been about Doyle mostly, and about her mother, who had died 4 months before the Karath-Roman 4 posting, and who Marin had been thinking about with increasing frequency as the days passed, which was either a comfort or the beginning of an unhealthy psychological pattern, and she couldn't tell which from inside it. On day 5, in the late afternoon when the frequency was in her chest, and the infection had started, and she'd been lying in the notch between the boulders with her leg elevated and her med bag serving as a pillow, she'd started talking to herself. Not distress rambling. Something more organized than that. She'd been talking through the geology of the crystalline sand matrix, running herself through her third-year xenobiology notes from memory, testing the hypothesis about the creature's nervous system sensitivity. She'd done this for 2 hours. At the end of 2 hours, she'd had what she later recognized as the core of the electrical discharge idea, and she'd written it in her notes in the careful shorthand she used for theoretical work, the kind where she was uncertain enough that she marked every assumption with a bracket. The brackets had been numerous. On the morning of day 6, 4 hours before Kethais's shuttle came down, she had watched the sun detonate on the horizon and thought with a clarity that surprised her, I'm going to be all right, not as a performance of hope, as a conclusion reached from evidence. The infection was progressing but manageable. She had water for approximately 2 more days if she maintained discipline. The creatures had a predictable schedule, and she had, so far, correctly predicted their behavior. She had a partial plan that needed a working shuttle to execute and no working shuttle. But she had a partial plan, which meant she had a variable. The shuttle and variables tended to resolve themselves if you survived long enough to wait for them. 4 hours later, a shuttle had appeared in the northern sky. She had thought, looking at it, there is the variable. This was the kind of thought that sounded, when she tried to explain it afterward, as if she were claiming some irrational confidence in the universe's cooperation. She did not have that confidence. She knew perfectly well that the shuttle might have come down 50 kilometers away, or come down and exploded, or come down with no surviving personnel, or any number of other resolutions that would not have been helpful. But she had been waiting for a variable for 4 hours, and the variable had arrived, and she had permitted herself exactly 1 second of something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite vindication, and was somewhere in the territory between them. Then she'd gone to meet it. What she had not permitted herself to think about, not on day 3, not on day 5, not on the morning of day 6, was the alternative. The alternative where no shuttle came. The alternative where the infection progressed faster than she managed it, or the creatures changed their pattern, or the water ran out. She had not permitted that particular line of thought because it was not useful information. It was not observation that could be organized. It was just fear with no data, and fear with no data was the only kind of fear she didn't know what to do with. Her mother had known what to do with it. Her mother had said once, not the phrase about stubbornness, a different one, late in the illness, when Marin had been sitting beside the bed trying to hold her own face together, that the only thing worth being afraid of was stopping. Everything else was just weather. Everything else is just weather. Marin had written that in her notes on day 4 between the wave pattern measurements and the water inventory, and she had looked at it several times since, and it had not made the fear smaller, but it had given it somewhere to sit that wasn't in the middle of everything else. The recovery crafts medic finished with her leg and packed up with the efficient quiet of a professional who understood that the patient needed space more than conversation. Marin thanked him, genuinely, concisely, in hegemony standard, and he acknowledged it and moved away. Davin, across the cabin, was writing something on a data tablet. Teva was sitting with her knees drawn up, looking at the viewport, looking at the stars with an expression that Marin recognized. The expression of someone who'd just been very close to a different outcome, and was in the process of understanding what that meant. "You did well," Marin said across the cabin. Teva looked at her. "On the sand, you moved well, you were patient." Marin paused. "The waiting is the hardest part. People with training tend to want to take action. You waited when waiting was the right thing. That's not nothing." Teva was quiet for a moment. "I was afraid," she said. "Yes," Marin said. "So was I. Fear is observation that hasn't been organized yet. You organized it." Something in Teva's expression shifted. Not relief exactly, not gratitude, something quieter and more useful than either. Davin looked up from his tablet. "I owe you an acknowledgement," he said to Marin. "You don't." "I doubted your assessment. I said so, and I was prepared to override it if the air had not intervened. That was a mistake in judgment, and I prefer to acknowledge mistakes when I identify them rather than let them sit." He held her gaze, steady, professional. "Your assessment was correct at every point." Marin looked at him. He was not a man who made that kind of statement lightly. She could see that. She accepted it the way she accepted things that were offered seriously. "Thank you," she said. "For what it's worth, your instinct to cover the opposite approach when we were inside the rocks was exactly right. If there had been a secondary threat vector from behind, we'd have been grateful for it." He nodded once. It was enough. Kethais, still beside her, was watching this exchange with an attention that Marin caught in her peripheral vision. "You are very deliberate with the people around you," the air said quietly. "I'm a doctor," Marin said. "I spend most of my professional life making rapid assessments of people and then acting on them. You get deliberate or you get sloppy. It's more than professional." Marin thought about this honestly. "I don't know if there's a clean line between what I'm like professionally and what I'm like otherwise. 6 years of medical training and 10 years of practice, and then research postings that take you a long way from anyone who knew you before all of it." She paused. "You become the job, a little. The observation becomes how you move through everything." "Is that a loss?" "I used to think so," she said. "I think now that it's just a shape. There are worse shapes to have." The stars outside the viewport were very dense. Karathroman 4 had not moved into the inner belt yet, and the view from this angle was full of the hegemony's home arm, the cluster that had so many common names in so many languages that the astronomers had long since given up on standardization. In one human language, the central cluster was called the lantern. In another, the wound. In another still, depending on translation, something that meant roughly the place where the first people came from, and the place where the last ones will go, which was either beautiful or horrifying, and Marin had never been able to decide which. She had been looking at it from the rock formation at night for 6 days. It was different with Karath Roman 4 visible below and the clean vacuum between her and it. More honest, maybe. No sand, no subsonic frequency, no thing in the dark with crystalline teeth. Just the stars and the distance. "What will you do," Kethai said, "when you've recovered, after the medical facility?" "Finish writing up the survey data," Marin said. "Submit it through formal channels and also directly to whoever in the Third House's research division has the authority to act on it. Draft the investigation recommendation." She paused. "And probably take some time off, which is something I keep telling myself I'll do." "Will you?" "Probably not immediately. There's a xenobiology symposium on the third station in 2 months that I submitted an abstract to 8 weeks ago. It's about neural pathway convergence in crystalline substrate organisms, which was a theoretical paper when I submitted it, and is considerably less theoretical now." Kethai's was quiet for a moment. "The Third Station Symposium is hosted by the Hegemony Science Directorate," she said. "My house has a standing delegation." "I know." "Then you know that a formal invitation from the Third House would." "I know what it would do," Marin said, "for my position at the research station and for the reception the investigation recommendation would receive." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not trying to negotiate. I'm going to submit the data and the recommendation regardless of what reception they get, but I'm also not going to tell you that it wouldn't matter." "It will matter," Kethai said simply. "I will make sure it matters." Marin looked at her. The heir's face in the craft's interior light was composed and direct, and Marin thought again about that quality of stillness, the effort inside it, the choice it represented, the thing it covered over and the thing it revealed. "Those 6 names," Kethai said. "Yes. I will say them to my mother." Marin understood what that meant in the context of hegemony Third House custom, the meaning of names spoken to the household matriarch, the weight of that. She received it as it was meant. "Thank you," she said. "Petravine," Kethai said quietly from memory in the correct hegemony pronunciation. "Siren Ol, Koran Merk, Tal Merk, Asavelt, Jin Rask." All 6, perfect recall. The heir had been listening to Marin say them and had held everyone. Marin did not say anything. There was nothing useful to say, and some things didn't need the addition of words. She looked at the stars. The craft moved through the dark, engine steady, nothing like the frequency that had lived in her chest for 6 days. She was going to write the best paper of her career. She was going to get the names into the official record. She was going to keep the leg. She thought, not done, not done, not done. And the stars moved past the viewport in their uncountable numbers, every one of them ancient and indifferent and, from here, very beautiful. She did not sleep immediately after all. She had thought she would. The antibiotics and the warmth of the craft and the first real safety in 6 days should have been enough, and they were close to enough. But her mind did the thing it did, the thing she'd tried to train out of it over years and had never fully managed. It kept observing. Even in the dark behind her closed eyes, the data continued to organize itself. The wave patterns, the timing, the crystalline matrix conductivity, the dorsal ridge breaking the surface in those last seconds before the pulse hit, white gold and enormous and briefly, terribly visible. She had been 3 meters from something that size. She had stood between the boulders for 6 days, 3 meters from something that size, and she had taken notes and photographed the sand and measured the streaks on her leg and rationed her water by milliliters. She had done all of that. She had done it alone, in the dark some of the time, in the killing heat the rest of it, with a broken bone and a progressively infectious wound, and the subsonic frequency pressing on her sternum like a slow hand. She had done it because there was no one else to do it, and because not doing it would have meant lying down in the dark of the rock formation and letting the detonation sun and the infection and the things in the sand have her, and she was not available for that. She was not available for that. She thought about her professors, the one who'd told her she asked too many hypothetical questions, the one who'd called humanity a curiosity species. She thought about the symposium abstract she'd submitted, now considerably more empirically grounded than it had been 8 weeks ago. She thought about what it would mean to walk into that symposium with a first-hand data set that no one else in the hegemony had, with 6 confirmed subjects and geological survey data, and the pulse discharge calculation, and the dorsal ridge photograph she'd managed to take with a shaking hand in the last second before she'd gone back inside the rocks. She thought it would mean something worth having gone through this to get. That was a thought that her mother would have appreciated. Her mother, who had believed with a ferocity that bordered on the theological that nothing useful came without its corresponding cost, and that the cost did not make the thing less yours, that the cost was part of the thing. That you carried both of them together, the achievement and the price of it, and you didn't get to separate them and keep only the part that felt good. Jin Rask had been 26 years old, the training certification date on the ID tag. Marin kept all of that. She would carry all of it, the data and the names and the 6 days and the weight of the air's hand over hers, and the specific color of the smoke columns rising from the crystalline sand in the late afternoon light of a sun that detonated every morning like it meant it. She kept everything. That was what she did. She was a doctor and a researcher and a human being who had decided she was not done, and she kept everything, and she made it count for something. The craft banked slightly, adjusting course, and through the viewport the stars wheeled with the turn and settled into new positions and stayed there, steady and very old and extraordinarily numerous. Marin Voss, aboard a hegemony recovery craft, one broken leg healing, one alien air beside her, the universe enormous and continuing in all directions, closed her eyes. And slept.